Today, I'm gonna be recommending 50, yes, 50 must-read fantasy books. This video took quite a while to put together, if I'm being honest, but these are books that I think are essential for any fantasy reader. Obviously, not every book is going to work for everyone, but these are books that I think everyone should give a chance because they're some of the best of the genre. And like I said, this video did take quite a while to put together, so if you can just, like and subscribe if you're not, that would be great, and leave a comment down below letting me know which books I forgot to include on this list. Let me know how I messed up and I missed all these other fantastic series that should have been on the list. Let me know in the comments. Also, maybe tell me your favorites out of the books that I mentioned. And quickly, before getting into it, the channel has been blessed with a sponsor. IntoTheAM is the sponsor of today's video, and they're always my favorite brand to work with. Don't tell the other brands. And they recently sent me some awesome pieces from their new fall collection. I am a huge fan of waffle knit shirts and Henleys, and as soon as I saw they had some new waffle knit Henleys, I knew I had to have these, and I'm not disappointed. I mean, the quality of this material, it's not flimsy, okay? This is a nice thick material to keep you warm. It's also a great item that you can layer with, one of their new flannel jackets. These are great for date nights, casual events, or even just winding down. And their motto, work hard, wear easy, to me is perfect for this new collection. Whether I'm spending hours working on a video or I'm wanting to wind down, IntoTheAM keeps me comfy. So whether you're working hard and grinding, or you just want to be cozy, then you can opt for a comfortable, relaxed fit to truly unwind this fall. And with their new long sleeve polos, their waffle knit long sleeves, their hoodies and flannel jackets, and all the new products they have for their fall collection, you can stay comfortable without sacrificing style. So get ready to upgrade your fall wardrobe. Head to the link in the description, grab your favorites from their fall collection, and don't forget to use my discount code captured in words at checkout to get 10% off your entire order. Huge thank you to IntoTheAM for sponsoring another video. Let's start with the book that laid down the foundation of modern fantasy fiction, The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. In this classic tale, Tolkien didn't just write a children's story, he crafted an entire mythology inspired by English landscapes, folklore, and various European myths. And as a linguist, Tolkien was passionate about creating a fully realized world filled with diverse cultures, languages, and histories, and remarkably, he achieved this within the pages of a relatively short book intended for young readers. A feat that's obviously been celebrated for decades. Now, this is one of those stories that had a huge influence on getting me into reading more. And the journey is just so memorable, following Bilbo, a hobbit who enjoys a quiet life, suddenly being uplifted into this grand adventure by a wise and powerful wizard and a band of determined dwarves. A journey that leads to encountering goblins, trolls, engaging in riddles, barrel riding, and ultimately facing the challenge of stealing from a dragon. Everyone needs to read The Hobbit. And bouncing off of that, The Lord of the Rings stands as the cornerstone of fantasy literature, remaining the most significant and influential work in the genre's history. Building upon the foundation laid in The Hobbit, Tolkien expanded his vision into an entire world, complete with its own rich history, intricate lore, and complex languages. Honestly, there's not many fantasy books out there that have a world that's so fully realized as Middle-earth, or Arda. Now, The Lord of the Rings also solidified many elements of European folklore and mythology into the staples of fantasy that we recognize today. So if you're a fan of the fantasy genre, its themes, settings, and archetypes, then The Lord of the Rings is an essential read. It is the epitome of epic fantasy and world building, making it one of the greatest fantasies ever written. And in my opinion, it holds up incredibly well. I still find these books so enjoyable to read. Also, I recommend the fan-made audiobooks by Phil Dragash. They have the musical score from the movies and incredible voice acting, and it was all made by one guy, and he made them for free. Published in 1977, The Sword of Shannara by Terry Brooks, while very influenced from Tolkien, it still stands on its own as such a fantastic book, and the series is responsible for really a boom in fantasy back in the 70s. A lot of people were afraid that they couldn't live up to Tolkien, and so fantasy was suffering, but then Terry Brooks came in and wrote this iconic series. And despite Terry Brooks having an extensive body of work and lasting influence within the fantasy community, The Sword of Shannara, his debut novel, is still his most well-known. Also, I gotta say, I love that original art by the Hildebrandt brothers. Set in a distant future thousands of years after a cataclysmic nuclear war, the world of the Sword of Shannara is one where technology has largely faded, giving way to magic and familiar high fantasy races including elves, dwarves, gnomes, and trolls. Right off the bat, you know this novel embodies those classic elements of epic high fantasy with a grand adventure and timeless themes. This makes it so cozy and such a beloved classic. It took a lot of what Tolkien laid down, but with a new spin on it, and more accessible. And while The Sword of Shannara continues to be celebrated as one of the best fantasy books, in my opinion, it's very overlooked in the modern audience. The legend of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table is the greatest British myth, inspiring countless writers and readers throughout the ages. Now, while King Arthur's tale has been adapted into numerous films and TV shows over the past century, its most acclaimed and beloved novelization is The Once and Future King by T.H. White. Originally published as 5 separate stories, The Sword in the Stone, The Witch in the Wood, The Ill-Made Knight, The Candle in the Wind, and The Book of Merlin. This collection brings together all the iconic characters of Arthurian legend. White's retelling of the story of Camelot is truly masterful. It's one that I feel like every fantasy fan should give a read, because really, without the legend of King Arthur, the fantasy genre as we know it might not even exist. Arthur himself was the character that popularized the Chosen One trope, and for fans of fantasy, The Once and Future King remains one of the most significant fantasies ever written, and it holds up so well. Now, I don't want to just keep recommending fantasy classics one after the other, so I'm gonna switch over to some modern must-reads. Like I said, I do want to include a mix of modern and classic recommendations in here, so a modern fantasy book that is a must-read is the Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee. Basically, the Greenbone Saga is like if the Godfather had a baby with Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and then sent that baby off to school in a gritty, jade-powered, kung fu, Asian Cold War-inspired epic fantasy world. At its heart, though, it's a family drama. Now, Jade City, the first book, throws you right into the heart of Janloon, this city that's run by 2 powerful crime families, the No Peak Clan and the Mountain Clan, both obsessed with jade. And jade in this world, it's not just, pretty green rock, it grants its wearers superhuman abilities. Think of it kind of like a drug that gives you super strength, agility, and more. But like a drug, it does have some lovely side effects, like possibly driving you insane if you're not careful. Now, the clash between tradition, loyalty, and modernity is intense as these clans are trying to control the jade trade. And the world that Lee builds here is so detailed and immersive. This is a series I've just been getting into, but I've been really enjoying it, and it is a must-read for any fantasy fan. Now for the next recommendation, imagine walking into a tower where every floor is a world unto itself, each level a different kingdom filled with wonders, mysteries, and dangers. The Books of Babel by Josiah Bancroft, it really isn't your typical setting at all. I mean, the Tower of Babel is not only enormous, it's this ever-shifting maze with its own politics, ecosystems, and histories, and each ringdom is so different from the other. Now, the story kicks off with Thomas Senlin, a quiet, scholarly headmaster who just wanted to enjoy his honeymoon in the legendary tower with his new wife, Maria. Instead, he loses her in the chaos of its lower levels, and what begins as a search for his lost wife quickly evolves into a journey of survival, personal transformation, and discovery as Senlin confronts the dark underbelly of the tower and the brutal hierarchies that govern each tier. Each floor of the tower brings new allies and enemies, as well as entirely new challenges. Think bureaucratic dystopias, anarchist sky pirates, and mechanical marvels all wrapped up into one. Now, Bancroft's writing is a major highlight. This feels like a modern classic, and the depth of the characters, the growth that Senlin goes through from this passive, naive man to a determined force to be reckoned with is a core strength to the series. His transformation is gradual and believable as he learns that survival in the tower requires cunning, adaptability, and a willingness to sacrifice his former self. Next is a book I never see recommended anywhere, and that is Retribution Falls by Chris Wooding. If you're at all interested in steampunk, then you need to read this book. This is the first book in the Tales of the KDJ series. It's a steampunk adventure set in a world where airships rule the skies and sky pirates carve out a dangerous existence, and the story follows Captain Darian Frey and his ragtag crew of misfits aboard the KDJ, as they take on various jobs that are as morally ambiguous as they are dangerous. It's got a very similar vibe to Firefly or Cowboy Bebop, both of which are some of my favorite shows, so if you like those, then you should read this book. It has some really clever dialogue, and it really focuses in on that found family trope that I love so much. The crew, the dynamics of the crew are fantastic. They're all charismatic and flawed and endearing. Retribution Falls deserves so much more attention, so I'm putting it on your radar. And it's time for another classic epic fantasy, the Riftwar Saga by Raymond E. Feist. The saga kicks off with Magician, where we meet Pug, a humble kitchen boy who, surprise surprise, has hidden magical talents that set him on a journey from apprentice to one of the most powerful magicians in Midkemia. Now, before you think this is your standard farm boy saves the world type of story, Feist throws in this massive twist, the rift between Midkemia and Kelowna, this world full of enigmatic, battle-hardened aliens called the Surani. By the way, I have no clue if I'm pronouncing all of these right. I didn't listen to the audiobooks. But of course, we got epic battles, strategic warfare, and political intrigue that spans not just kingdoms, but entire worlds. Now, the deep exploration of these two vastly different cultures that are clashing, with Pug caught right in the middle, is just so engaging. And that's just the beginning. I mean, each book ups the stakes. I'm really surprised it took me so long to finally get to the series. It's definitely worth all of the praise it gets. So if you're into high stakes, action-packed fantasy with a deep and immersive world, the Riftwar Saga should definitely be on your reading list. Now, if you're wanting to experience the origin of the sword and sorcery genre, then by Crom, you'd better read the Conan books by Robert E. Howard, created in the 1930s. These stories are a blend of brutal action and really fascinating world building. Conan isn't just hacking through enemies, though yes, he does do a lot of that. He's exploring the Hyborian Age, a mythical era that Howard created, which is placed after Atlantis sank, but before real-world civilizations arose. And Conan's personality is equally parts savage warrior and surprisingly a cunning strategist. And this is something a lot of the Conan adaptations get wrong. He isn't just a muscle-headed brute, he's also very intelligent and has more layers than you'd think. Now, obviously, Howard's Conan stories are classic pulp fiction. They're full of fast-paced action and clever plotting. Do these still hold up? Well, for the standards of a 1930s white Texan dude, Howard was progressive. By today's standards, there's some ideas and opinions that definitely show their age. Not as bad as many other authors of his time, though, and you shouldn't expect everything to match modern standards anyway. Overall, these actually hold up much better than I was expecting. They're still surprisingly really fun and fast-paced adventures, and they're easy to get into. I'd recommend reading just the original stories by Robert E. Howard. Some of the other authors that went on to write Conan stories didn't quite match that same quality. Actually, Robert Jordan did write some good ones too, so those are worth checking out. And then we have the emotional ride that is the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb, and really her entire Realm of the Elderlings series. Now, the beauty of Robin Hobb's writing lies in its elegant simplicity. The Realm of the Elderlings is really richly detailed, but it's also very accessible, and it's told on a personal level. It's easy to immerse yourself in these stories and see this world from these characters' eyes. Unfortunately, you're gonna have to go through a lot of abuse while reading it through Fitz's eyes, because Fitz Chivalry Farseer goes through a lot of crap. Assassin's Apprentice is the beginning of the Farseer trilogy and the beginning of Fitz's journey. Fitz, a royal bastard, is raised in the shadows of the royal court under the care of Burich, the stable master. Despite his lowly status, Fitz is trained in secret as a royal assassin while learning to navigate the perilous waters of court intrigue. And the way that Hobb portrays Fitz's internal and external struggles is truly just masterful. I'm not even exaggerating here. The depth to his character development is what really made it hard for me to put these books down. And also the subtle way that Hobb weaves in the magic into the narrative. There's a magic called the Wit, this ancient magic that allows Fitz to communicate with animals, which, by the way, if you like animal companions, then you should probably read the Farseer trilogy. Or maybe don't. I take it back. Yes, you should read it. Hobb's writing has a lot of emotional depth to it, which is something you don't see in many fantasy novels, and she quietly builds up this tension, leading to moments of powerful payoff. And the relationships between the characters are complex and realistic, making their struggles and triumphs deeply affecting. I don't think I've cared so much, but also been so annoyed by a character than I have been by Fitz Chivalry Farseer. And that's why the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb is a must-read. Now, you might have heard of the Dying Earth series by Jack Vance, a collection of interconnected stories written in the 1950s to the 1980s. I've seen many authors like Neil Gaiman and George R.R. Martin cite these books as inspiration, and I finally decided to give them a read myself. Now, this collection of stories is basically like if you threw Monty Python, Alice in Wonderland, and maybe a bit of Dark Souls or Elden Ring into a blender, and then sprinkled it with a dusting of eldritch, Lovecraftian cosmic horror, and hit puree. The Dying Earth series is set in the distant future, at a point when the sun is almost exhausted, humanity is near extinction, and technology has largely been forgotten, and magic has taken its place. There's mutated animals and monsters roaming the world, along with scraps of humanity trying to survive, and powerful wizards controlling spells developed in ages past. Now, magic here has loose links to the science of old, and advanced mathematics is treated like arcane lore. And the sheer limitations of the magic make every encounter feel like a game of Dungeons and Dragons, with the wizards hoping they guessed right about which spells to pack for the day. Which, by the way, if you play D&D, then I highly encourage you to read these stories. Many of the concepts, especially around name spells and memorize spells, were lifted directly from the Dying Earth. Anyway, the world here is so bizarre and colorful, and every inch of the scenery could double as an abstract painting that's trying to confuse you on purpose. The characters, too, are delightfully eccentric, vain princes, con artists, carnivorous deodans, and tiny creatures that ride on insects and trade information for salt cubes, because why not? Now, many of the stories follow this anti-hero named Kujel, who's a liar and a thief and a rogue, and he's such an interesting character to follow, as he's banished to the North Pole by a wizard and has to make the dangerous journey home to get his revenge. Despite being written in the 1950s, this series has a timeless charm to it. There's a few things that are a bit dated, but overall it's still so enjoyable, and Vance's poetic style, mixing humor, irony, and a dash of existential dread in just the right amounts. You need to read The Dying Earth by Jack Vance. American Gods is regarded by many to be Neil Gaiman's magnum opus. Fantasy as a genre has its roots in ancient mythology and folklore, gods and heroes from Greek, Norse, and various other mythologies. And Neil Gaiman takes mythology and blends it up into this urban setting and asks the question, when Europeans stole the land of the Americas and brought some of their gods with them, what happened to the gods that were left behind? The basic idea is the more worshippers a god has, the more powerful they are. And the plot here, there is a building power struggle between the old gods, Norse, Native American, etc., and the new gods, technology, television, money. We follow a man named Shadow, whose wife dies in a car crash days before his release from prison. And he ends up encountering this mysterious Mr. Wednesday, who claims to be a refugee from a distant war, a former god, and the King of America. And together they begin a very strange journey across the heart of the USA. This is a book that won't let you go until you finish it. It is an incredible standalone and one of Neil Gaiman's very best. Now, I've actually just been getting into the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. I actually have a reading vlog for book 1 that's in the works. But I decided I need to mention it on this list even if I haven't finished the series yet. This is a mind-bending, genre-mashing epic, and I understand why people say this is King's magnum opus. I mean, it's a mix of horror, fantasy, sci-fi, and gritty western, and somehow these all collide, and it works so well. At the heart of this wild journey is Roland, the last gunslinger, who's on this obsessive quest to reach the Dark Tower, this mysterious structure that holds the keys to the entire multiverse. No big deal or anything. Now again, I'm just getting into this series. I have heard that it gets even better like after the first book, but I really enjoyed the first book. But it's a sprawling, imaginative, and often confusing journey just as much as it is compelling. And I'm really excited to read more of the Dark Tower, and I'll keep you guys updated on my thoughts. The Witcher series, created by Polish author Andrzej Sapkowski, has risen to international fame largely due to its widely popular video game adaptations and the Netflix series, which, while popular, was not my favorite, but it was responsible for bringing this series further into the mainstream and getting more people interested in reading the books. Now, this gritty, dark fantasy series draws heavily from Slavic and Eastern European folklore and mythology, which really brings a unique flavor into the genre. Unlike many fantasy series, the entry point here is The Last Wish, which is actually a collection of short stories rather than a full-length novel. The Last Wish consists of 7 interconnected tales that introduce readers to Geralt of Rivia, a professional monster hunter for hire who operates in a morally complex world filled with supernatural creatures and a lot of political intrigue. And through these stories, we get to know Geralt as more than just a monster slayer. He's a deeply principled and philosophical character. He's grappling with his place in a world that is often as monstrous as the creatures that he hunts. The Last Wish is not just a collection of monster hunting tales, it sets the stage for the larger Witcher saga, introducing many of the key characters and themes. And characters like Yennefer, Ciri, and Dandelion are so memorable and well-rounded characters that all have their own arcs. Sapkowski's ability to subvert typical fantasy tropes, turning them on their head with wit and a keen sense of irony, is always so enjoyable. The Witcher is a must-read. If you at all have any interest in RPGs, whether it's tabletop RPGs or video games, or even if you don't have any interest in RPGs, actually, you should just go read Dungeon Crawler Carl. And by read, I mean listen to the audiobooks, because these are some of the best audiobooks I have ever listened to, hands down. Now, this is kind of an odd series to describe because it sounds so absurd, and it is, but it also works incredibly well. And honestly, this is one of of my new favorite series, and Matt Dinniman has created an absolute must-read. Basically, in Dungeon Crawler Carl, aliens invade Earth and vaporize it and turn it into a multi-tiered dungeon, and the survivors are thrown into the dungeon, and like the Hunger Games, they have to survive by killing monsters and collecting magical loot and leveling up, and it's all being broadcast as the galaxy's favorite reality TV show. And Carl, our hero, ends up in this dungeon with his ex-girlfriend's cat, Princess Donut, who's the true protagonist of the show. After gaining a crazy amount of charisma, she's able to speak and becomes an overly glamorous sidekick. And Carl and Donut have to fight monsters and navigate an insane dungeon designed by a sadistic AI. Now, the humor in the series is dark and absurd, and it's filled with clever nods to gaming culture and RPG mechanics. There are truly some laugh-out-loud moments in this series, but then also it has some very emotional moments as well. And despite how absurd everything is, there's some moments that really focus in on human nature and the horror of the situation these survivors are in. I mean, the whole time Carl and Donut are figuring out how to win over viewers, collect loot boxes, and survive increasingly chaotic levels. And as their lives are very much on the line, they're also being called in for live shows and interviews with a wide range of weird alien species. If you're into video games or you enjoy stories that throw a sarcastic everyman into a bizarre and deadly situation, then you're going to love this series. And again, the audiobooks are amazing. You can thank me later. Okay, if I had to pitch Mistborn to someone, I would say it's like Ocean's 11, but in Mordor, after Sauron's been in power for 1,000 years. It's an iconic fantasy story of a slum girl who gets taken in by a den of thieves trying to overthrow an immortal emperor. If you like heist stories with a really interesting crew that have a great dynamic, then Mistborn is perfect for you. Also, they ingest metals for superpowers, but they don't get metal poisoning, so it's cool. And what's more metal than that? Well, I mean, they don't get poisoned as long as they burn their metal reserves. Anyways, don't try this at home. Now, Mistborn is a really great starting point for Sanderson's universe known as the Cosmere. Now, there is the original trilogy, as well as a secondary series known as the Wax and Wane series, or Mistborn Era 2, which is also fantastic, but to keep it simple, you just need to start with the original trilogy. Now, at the heart of Mistborn lies allomancy, a magic system based on the consumption and burning of various metals, and each metal grants its users specific powers, from enhanced strength and agility to the ability to manipulate emotions or push and pull on objects. And basically, Mistborn, with some practice, can push and pull off of metal objects to sling themselves around like Spider-Man. It is so much fun. There's a lot of possibilities with allomancy, and Sanderson makes sure to stay true to its limitations, while also allowing the protagonist to discover new ways of using their powers within those limitations. And dude, allomancy makes for some really cinematic and dynamic action scenes that are seriously begging for a TV or video game adaptation. And for another heist fantasy recommendation, there's always Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. This one follows the adventures of 6 teenage criminals hired to undertake a dangerous heist, while searching for love and redemption along the way. And the leader of the group is Kaz Brecker, the cunning, ruthless leader of the Dregs, one of the many street gangs in the port city of Ketterdam. And he assembles this ragtag crew to pull off the impossible, break into the world's most secure prison and kidnap a valuable asset. Now, each of the crows have their own baggage they bring with them. I mean, there's the trigger-happy gambler, a sort of acrobatic spy ninja, a magic user with some complicated feelings for her ex-enemy, and a demolition expert who's probably in over his head. Now, Bardugo's writing style is sharp, witty, and fast-paced. It keeps you on the edge of your seat the entire time. Personally, I do prefer Mistborn or even The Lies of Locke Lamora as in terms of heist novels, but I would still recommend Six of Crows. Now, David Gemmell was a legendary figure in British fantasy fiction, best known for his gritty and compelling tales of heroism and valor, and his first novel, Legend, published in 1984, is not only his most famous work, but also a seminal piece in the heroic fantasy genre. Now, this isn't your typical chosen one saves the day kind of story. This is a heroic bloodbath where aging warriors like Druss the Legend take center stage, fighting against impossible odds to defend the last stronghold of the Drenai people from an army of barbarian invaders. And Druss, he's not some plucky young hero. He's in his 60s, he's cranky, and he's still swinging his legendary axe like the legend that he is. We also follow a reluctant ex-soldier who's really just trying to avoid getting stabbed again, but naturally love and the fate of the Drenai kingdom pulls him back into the fray. And what really sets Legend apart is how it balances those epic action moments with some genuinely touching moments. There's so many emotional moments that just caught me off guard in this book. It has a surprising amount of depth and emotion behind all those epic heroic battles. And Gemmell's writing gets you straight to the heart of the action without bogging you down in endless exposition, which makes this a really thrilling read. If you like your fantasy with a side of redemption, sacrifice, and grizzled warriors fighting one last battle, Legend should be at the top of your list. And who doesn't love a story where the hero is basically the fantasy world's version of Clint Eastwood? Now, for a somewhat similar premise when it comes to character, I need to recommend Kings of the Wyld by Nicholas Eames. This is what happens when a classic D&D style adventuring party gets old and rusty, then decides to get the band back together for one last epic quest. Clay Cooper and his former band of legendary mercenaries, once the rock stars of monster slaying, are now dealing with bad knees, beer bellies, and midlife crisis. But when Gabriel, one of their old crew, shows up asking for help to rescue his daughter from a besieged city on the other side of the monster-infested Wyld, they can't resist the call to arms. This book-ended sequel is so much fun. Eames balances hilarious banter with some seriously heartfelt moments about aging, friendship, and fighting for what matters, like saving your friend's kid, or just trying to not get eaten by a giant owlbear. Plus, the world is packed with all sorts of crazy creatures, from massive trolls to undead bards, and the band's camaraderie feels genuine, complete with a ton of great banter and sharp one-liners. If you enjoy adventure, humor, and epic fantasy with kind of this nostalgic twist, you're gonna be cheering for these grizzled heroes as they rock out one last time across the Wyld. Also, I feel like if you're a fan of like Final Fantasy and classic JRPGs, then you're also going to enjoy this book a lot. There's even some references here and there. If you're in the mood for a fun and fast-paced fantasy that doesn't take itself too seriously but still hits you right in the feels, then go and read Kings of the Wyld. If you're looking for a beautiful fairy tale-like fantasy with a great cast of magical beasts, The Forgotten Beasts of Eld by Patricia McKillop is right up your alley. This is one of my favorite books. The writing is so beautiful and poetic. We follow a lonely, ivory-haired woman named Sybil who lives on the Eld Mountain with an eclectic menagerie of magical creatures, riddling boars, treasure-hoarding dragons, and even a vengeful falcon. And Sybil cares for these mythical creatures and shares a type of telepathy with them. Now, Sybil prefers the company of her beasts to humans, but when a baby is dropped at her doorstep, her quiet life gets a lot more complicated, as babies tend to do. And the story follows her as she learns to live and love in the world outside of the one she once knew. Now, the story blends poetic language with deep themes of power, love, and revenge, all while keeping you hooked. Even though this is a very quiet book, it's extremely powerful in a way. It's reminiscent of Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea, where the magic feels almost like a living, breathing thing. So if you're in the mood for a slower, more lyrical fantasy, then you need to read The Forgotten Beast of Eld. His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman is going to take you to a world where your soul literally walks beside you in the form of an animal, and then he'll proceed to then blow your mind with a mix of steampunk, magic, theology, and yes, armored polar bears. It all kicks off with the Golden Compass, or the Northern Lights if you're from the UK, where we meet Lyra, an orphan with a knack for causing trouble, and a destiny tied to a mysterious substance called dust. Now, Lyra's journey not only spans multiple worlds as she uncovers conspiracies and meets some very memorable characters, but it also dives into some heavy philosophical themes about life, death, and even the nature of the universe itself. Now trust me, even though this series was written for kids, there is a lot that adults can enjoy with these books as well. I was actually surprised at how well this series holds up reading it as an adult. I would highly recommend giving this series a read if you never have, and if you did read it growing up, you should give it a reread. The Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin was such an unexpected gem for me. It is a wonderful take on the genre. Really, it feels like something completely fresh in fantasy. It gets bonus points for the second-person point of view that I initially found to be very jarring, but then ultimately, I really liked it. And more bonus points for a non-standard fantasy protagonist. I really love how these books explored motherhood amidst generational trauma. It's probably the only fantasy that I've seen explore motherhood this well. If you don't know, the story takes place on a planet with a supercontinent called the Stillness, and every few centuries, its inhabitants endure what they call a fifth season of catastrophic climate change. The book follows the life of Asun, a woman who comes home to find that her husband has brutally murdered their son and kidnapped their daughter. Now, Asun is a person with the ability to control the earth and its movements, which is such a cool magic system. Also, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name right. Anyway, we're following her journey to find her daughter and survive the impending fifth season. The themes of oppression and casual cruelty in this world can get very heavy, but it is an incredible trilogy that you should read. The Name of the Wind, Book 1 in the Kingkiller Chronicle by Patrick Rothfuss, is often found in top 10 lists of the best fantasy, despite the series only having 2 books at the moment, and Book 3, The Doors of Stone, has been stalled for over a decade now. We don't know when it's going to release, but I know firsthand why this series is regarded so highly. I have reread The Name of the Wind and The Wise Man's Fear countless times, and there's few stories that have been able to draw me in as much as Kingkiller, with its lyrical prose, compelling drama and mysteries, and slice-of-life elements. The Name of the Wind begins with a really clever framing device, where our protagonist, Kvothe, a legendary figure, has hidden himself away and is living as an innkeeper known as Kote. However, his identity is uncovered by the Chronicler, this famous scribe, and the Chronicler asks Kvothe if he can pen his story. And so we're then thrown back to Kvothe's childhood as a member of a traveling troupe of performers. That is, until tragedy turns him homeless and begging on the streets. Eventually, Kvothe enrolls in the university in order to learn the magic system of this world, and I love the scientific magic here, and also the more mysterious naming magic. And he also goes to the university to discover more about the mysterious group of folkloric beings known as the Chandrian, a group whose carnage Kvothe has witnessed with his own eyes. Now, the description of music in this series is so vivid. There's also so much mystery here, whether it's the Chandrian, the Aemir, the Fae, or just the history and lore that sometimes changes or mirrors another story depending on who's telling it. Now, Rothfuss hides a lot of small details and clues. I mean, try searching for all 7-word sentences between Denna and Kvothe. There is a ton of content for theory crafting to keep you busy and speculating while joining the long wait for Book 3. I've made plenty of theory videos on the series, and it's always going to be one of my favorites and a must-read, as long as you don't mind waiting, if you don't mind reading it for the journey and not the destination, since there is very few answers and no conclusion as of yet. Next up, we have one of the best grimdark series out there, The Black Company by Glenn Cook. This series is comprised of 11 different novels and 5 short stories. This series follows an elite mercenary unit, the Black Company, through roughly 40 years of its approximately 400-year history. Now, one aspect that I really enjoyed that you don't see that often in fantasy is just the way that the story is told. Most of the story is written in journal entries by the company's physician. We do get other perspectives as the story moves along, but I just found this such an interesting way to read this story. It feels like you're reading some historical journal entries during wartime. And these books are gritty and realistic, and they perfectly portray war and just the horrors of war. I have not seen a series do so well at capturing that. Now, if you happen to be a manga reader, then obviously I'm going to recommend Berserk by Kentaro Miura. It really can't get much darker than Berserk. This is a grim, dark epic that, honestly, even if you've never read manga, you should give this series a read if you're a fan of grimdark. Though I do want to say, if you find that you dislike the series at the beginning, maybe you find the main character comes off a little too edgy, I would recommend to push through until you reach the Golden Age arc, which gives us an extended flashback that reveals his backstory. And after that, it's really hard to not sympathize with Guts, because pretty much everything that's bad happens to him, and I feel for his character a lot, and I understand why he's the way he is. Moving on to A Wizard of Earthsea. Now, Ursula K. Le Guin was a towering figure in the fantasy and sci-fi genres. Honestly, she was one of those authors I just look up to so much, and while she's often celebrated for her groundbreaking science fiction novels like The Left Hand of Darkness and The Dispossessed, she also made a significant impact on the fantasy genre with her books of Earthsea. The journey begins with A Wizard of Earthsea, a timeless fantasy novel that appeals to readers of all ages, set in a world dominated by vast oceans and archipelagos rather than large continents. The story follows Ged, a boy from a modest island who possesses extraordinary magical abilities, and the novel is Ged's coming-of-age tale, charting his growth from a headstrong youth to a wise and powerful wizard. And Ged's journey is just so memorable. Now, A Wizard of Earthsea introduced several foundational elements to the fantasy genre, but particularly it introduced this intricate magic system and the concept of a school for witches and wizards. After using magic to protect his island from raiders, Ged is apprenticed to a wizard and later is sent to a magical school to develop both his mind and his abilities. And this basically set the stage for the appeal of magical education in fantasy literature. C.S. Lewis, a close companion of the legendary J.R.R. Tolkien, carved out his own place in the world of fantasy literature with the Chronicles of Narnia, a timeless classic that began with his most famous installment, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which we all know tells the story of 4 siblings evacuated to the English countryside during World War II, and in their new home, they stumble upon a magical wardrobe that serves as a portal to the fantastical land of Narnia, a world that's been trapped in an eternal winter by the White Witch. And here the children embark on this epic journey filled with wonder and danger, talking animals and mythical creatures, and ultimately the noble lion Aslan, who helps them in their quest to free Narnia. There's something so cozy and nostalgic about the Chronicles of Narnia. I grew up reading these, and they still hold a really special place in my heart. I love the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, the Silver Chair, the Boy and His Horse, and the Magician's Nephew. Okay, I love them all. Now, Terry Pratchett was a gift to literature, and his Discworld novels are incredible. They are so brilliant, and I urge you to give this series a try. If I had to pick one sub-series out of all the Discworld novels that I would highly recommend, I would go with Guards, which is book 1 in the City Watch books. At the heart of the story is Captain Sam Vimes, a washed-up cynical guard, but when a secret society decides it's a great idea to summon a dragon and take over the city, Vimes Theseus and his ragtag group of misfits, including a literal 6-foot-tall dwarf named Carrot. Don't ask, just read it yourself. They're forced into action, and basically everything that can go wrong does go wrong, yet somehow the underdogs of the Night Watch find a way to survive. Now, Pratchett's writing is always so full of wit. Again, I just recommend reading all the Discworld novels. He has a great way at poking fun at classic fantasy tropes. His characters are vivid and lovable even when they're at their worst, and even manages to sneak in moments of real heart. Guards is such a great book. It is a must-read, and just be warned, once you visit Discworld, you might never want to leave. Perdido Street Station by China Miéville is probably the strangest book I've read. It's set in the fictional world of Bazlag. This book is a doorstopper steampunk fantasy that takes place in the stinking junkyard rotting city of New Crobuzon, where magic, science, and alchemy all coexist. Now, it's often described as weird fiction, which is very accurate. The plot is definitely a slow burn, but it's very compelling, and it immediately hooks you in right from chapter 1. It's filled with deep and relevant themes, the writing is truly outstanding, and the world building is clearly designed by an incredible imagination. If you want something weird, you should read it. Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn is a series that, in my opinion, doesn't get nearly enough love in the fantasy community anymore, despite influencing a generation of fantasy writers, including George R.R. Martin, the echoes of which can be felt in A Song of Ice and Fire with its intricate plotting and realistic portrayal of medieval life. Now, this trilogy, comprising the Dragonbone Chair, Stone of Farewell, and Two Green Angel Tower, is honestly a masterclass in traditional epic fantasy storytelling. Tad Williams has crafted a world that is rich in history and lore. Osten-Ard is a place teeming with different cultures, languages, and landscapes. It's kind of reminiscent of Tolkien's Middle-earth in terms of its depth and complexity. Not to say Williams just made a Tolkien ripoff. No, he brought his own unique flavor to it, so it feels familiar yet fresh. Now, the series follows Simon, a kitchen boy who becomes embroiled in a monumental struggle against these dark forces that are threatening the world. Now, Simon's journey from a naive boy to a hero is honestly beautifully portrayed. The growth feels natural and earned, and it makes him a protagonist that you can't help but root for. And Simon is a character that you just grow to care for more and more. Now, even Christopher Paolini, author of The Inheritance Cycle, has said that Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn is one of the great fantasy epics of all time. So if you're a fan of epic fantasy, then you are missing out if you haven't read this series yet. It's a series that demands some patience, but the payoff is more than worth it. Thanks to the monumental success of its HBO adaptation, George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire has become as widely recognized as The Lord of the Rings, and for good reason. I mean, few authors come as close to rivaling Tolkien in terms of the sheer scale and intricate world building and lasting cultural impact. I mean, A Game of Thrones, the first novel in the series, set the stage for what would become a phenomenon in modern literature. While the series does have many of those classic elements of high fantasy with knights and dragons and towering castles and vast fleets, what truly sets it apart though is its relentless focus on the more gritty realities of political intrigue. Martin's world of Westeros is one where power is constantly shifting, alliances are fragile, and betrayal is a common occurrence. The series operates on both a macro and a micro level, showcasing the vast geopolitical struggles alongside the more intimate personal betrayals that leave a profound impact on the characters and readers alike. And of course, one of the most defining characteristics of A Song of Ice and Fire is its brutal unpredictability. The narrative is famously unforgiving, with beloved characters meeting untimely and often shocking ends, making the stakes grow ever higher. Now, Martin's inspiration from historical events like The Wars of the Roses lends kind of a layer of realism and gravity to the political machinations within the story, and the series' intricate plot twists, complex character arcs, and deeply human struggles makes it not just a masterpiece of the genre, but really a groundbreaking work that continues to influence fantasy literature and pop culture on a massive scale. Martin's world building and character dynamics have cemented A Song of Ice and Fire as a landmark series that every fantasy fan should read. And I know, it's embarrassing, I haven't read all the books yet in A Song of Ice and Fire, I'm not caught up, but I do plan on changing that and getting caught up this year. Piranesi by Susanna Clarke is a captivating and atmospheric novel that takes readers on a journey to a vast labyrinth-like world of corridors filled with statues, cryptic rooms, and an ever-changing tide. And the house itself becomes kind of a character. It's mysterious and alive, it evokes a sense of both beauty and foreboding. Now, Clarke's attention to detail and her ability to create a rich and immersive environment truly sets Piranesi apart. And at the heart of the story is the protagonist, the man who calls himself the beloved child of the house. And he's also called Piranesi. As Piranesi explores the house and uncovers its mysteries, we're taken on this philosophical journey of self-discovery, with a narrative that starts off slow but then gradually feeds us these big reveals. Now, Clarke's writing style is very poetic and elegant, and it immerses you in this richly descriptive and atmospheric world. I would say this book is a literary masterpiece that showcases Susanna Clarke's extraordinary talent for storytelling, mystery, and building an atmospheric setting. It's one of my favorite books I read this year. Gormenghast by Mervyn Peake. This is such a strange book. This is another one where the setting is basically a character itself. Castle Gormenghast is an ancient, sprawling castle that stretches for miles. So massive that the inhabitants can't even imagine a world outside of it. It's an endless maze of galleries, a labyrinth of cryptic rooms, dark corridors, endless stairs, and secret passages. From the Hall of Bright Carvings to the Hall of Spiders to a room filled with cats, all the way up to the Tower of Flints, which is inhabited by a great number of owls. The castle is a monster, but the quirky inhabitants are just as odd. They're a mixed bunch of neurotics and eccentrics who follow their endless traditional rituals, which over the years have now lost all meaning. But all that changes when Titus Groan is born, the new heir to Gormenghast. Book 1 was published in 1946, and this book is the ultimate gothic fantasy. It's beautiful in a Dickinson or Burton-esque type of way. It has some really incredible prose, but keep in mind it's more about place than plot. The writing is ponderous and dense, but it's a book like no other. If you're a fan of Dragonriders, then you need to go back and read the books that pretty much started that trope, and that is the Dragonriders of Pern by Anne McCaffrey. This is a beloved classic for a reason. Imagine a world where bioengineered dragons and their human riders are the last line of defense against deadly spores falling from space, because that's just the sort of thing you're going to find in Pern. With telepathic dragons, ancient prophecies, and a bit of time travel, yes, dragons can time travel, McCaffrey created a series that blends sci-fi and fantasy in a totally unique way, and it all kicked off with Dragonflight, where the Dragon Riders are mostly forgotten, and the planet's threat, the Deadly Thread, has become legend. The first trilogy, Dragonflight, Dragon Quest, and the White Dragon, is top-tier stuff. If you love a blend of sci-fi and fantasy, and you love dragons, and you haven't read this, then you need to. We need to talk about the Inheritance Cycle. This was one of those fantasy series in the early 2000s that introduced many young readers to the vast realms of fantasy fiction. For me, it wasn't the series that sparked my love for fantasy. That would belong to Deltora Quest by Emily Rada, but it was one of those early reads that contributed to my love for the genre. Around 4th grade, I read the first 2 and really enjoyed them, but for some reason I never continued, that is, until now. And wow, you know what? I enjoyed it. It holds up pretty well, especially if you consider the intended audience. The amount of people I have seen comparing it to the Wheel of Time, or insert other adult fantasy series, let me stop you right there. This is young adult fantasy. It is made for children and teens. Is it the most original fantasy out there? No, and it's not trying to be. This is a classic textbook Tolkien-esque fantasy for children, and it's a great beginner fantasy. Yet it has enough depth to it that many adults can still find enjoyment. The 2002 smash hit novel Eragon follows a teen farm boy as he comes into his own as a dragon rider after finding a mysterious stone that hatches a dragon. Struck with grief at the death of his uncle and seeking revenge, he joins the storyteller Braum, and together with Saphira they embark on a grand and beautiful trek through the magical world of Alagasia, a journey that would go on to span 4 books, some companion novels, and now the recent Murtagh, with apparently more books planned in the future. Now, even if you're reading Eragon for the first time, it's going to feel like a familiar story in the coziest of ways. It has many of those familiar fantasy tropes that some might find tiring while others find comfort in, while also having enough originality to make it memorable. I especially enjoyed Paulini's descriptions of the landscapes of Alagasia. They bring a lot of grandeur to captivate your imagination, and there is a lot of depth to this world that's lacking in many other young adult fantasy stories that I've read. I truly enjoyed getting lost in the world of Alagasia. If you're in the mood for a series that masterfully combines the gritty charm of noir detective fiction with the more mystical elements of urban fantasy, look no further than the Dresden Files. I mean, this is basically a cornerstone of urban fantasy. We follow Harry Dresden, Chicago's very own wizard for hire and a private detective, as he navigates a world where the supernatural is just another facet of this urban landscape. From the very first book, Stormfront, you're drawn into this really well-constructed universe where vampires, werewolves, fairies, and other mythological creatures are not just myths, they're Dresden's Thursday afternoon. Butcher's writing is very accessible, it's easy to get into, and it shines with wit. I mean, Harry is not just a protagonist, but he feels like a companion through the darkest alleyways of Chicago's magical underworld. The Lies of Loch Lamora. Scott Lynch delivered one of the best debuts of the 21st century with this book, book 1 in The Gentleman Bastard. And at the heart of the story is Loch Lamora, who as a child is taken in by the Thiefmaker after being orphaned. But because he's too much of a troublemaker, the Thiefmaker sells Loch to Father Chains, a priest who secretly runs a school for thieves. And under Chains' tutelage, Loch becomes a cunning and skilled con artist, and he ends up leading the Gentleman Bastards, a band of elite thieves who pull off complex heists against Camor's nobility. But their latest scheme entangles them in a deadly game of power, betrayal, and survival. Now, Camor is a city inspired by Renaissance-era Venice, and this city of canals and ancient structures and a dangerous criminal underworld is definitely one of the more memorable settings in fantasy. Now, Lynch has this really eloquent but sharp writing style, and I love how he balances out the humor with the more darker elements of the story. And the witty banter between the crew and the friendships make this such an enjoyable found family type of story. I highly recommend this book. If you love heist stories and character-driven narratives with a rich, dynamic friendships between the characters and some really great banter, then you need to read this series. The Sword of Kaigen actually started off as a self-published work, and it garnered a lot of widespread acclaim, and for good reason. The Sword of Kaigen is a lot more than just a tale of elemental magic and military might. It is a deeply personal story about family, identity, and the harsh realities of war. And Wong's characters, especially Misaki Matsuda, are richly developed and multifaceted. I mean, Misaki in particular has been praised as one of the more complex characters in contemporary fantasy, and the struggles that she goes through between duty and self-identity resonate deeply with a lot of people. And Misaki is a mother, which we don't see a lot of in fantasy. Shout out to all mothers. And I really liked ML Wong's choice to have Misaki's motherhood be an important part of her character without reducing her to the role of mother. She's a lot more than she seems. I mean, she was a former warrior, but due to her having married into a very conservative family, she's hidden her past from her community, but we get to see some of that former warrior appear. Momoru is such a great character as well, and Wong's skillful handling of difficult themes such as grief, regret, mental health, and societal expectations really adds some depth to the narrative on a personal level, something that you can think about in your daily life. In my opinion, it is clear that ML Wong is not just a rising star, but a transformative voice in the genre. Next, we have the Riyria Revelations by Michael J. Sullivan, starting off with Theft of Swords. These books deserve all the praise they get and so much more. Really, they're not talked about enough. This is a series that I found so satisfying. Like, there's so many twists and turns. I was surprised so often. I think it's going one way, and then it completely changes directions and surprises me. Ultimately, the entire story revolves around a pair of thieves, Hadrian and Royce. They're both extremely different and a lot of fun. Royce is this cold-blooded killer and the real thief of the group. And Hadrian is basically the good-natured muscle of the two. And they're basically legendary thieves. They're known to complete their missions with ghost-like efficiency. And right at the start of the book, you can tell they've been working together for quite some time. But while the two of them enter the series with fully formed skills, we get to see them evolve as characters and grow. And these two are so much fun. If you love some good banter, if you like a bromance in fantasy, this is one of the best. Now, if you're ready to have your brain scrambled in the best possible way, The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe is your next stop. Set on a far future dying Earth, this 4-book series is equal parts mind-bending science fantasy and deep philosophical exploration, all wrapped up in prose that is so dense you might need a machete to get through it, but trust me, it is worth it. The story follows Severian, an apprentice in the Guild of Torturers who's banished for committing the ultimate crime, showing mercy. From there, he embarks on an epic, surreal journey where the lines between reality, memory, and myth blur at every turn. Now, Wolfe isn't content with just telling a story. Oh no, he throws in an unreliable narration, puzzles, and layers of symbolism that are so deep, you're going to be pondering them long after you've finished reading this. Now, despite being packed with literary trickery, the series has its fair share of sci-fi fun as well. I mean, there's ancient technologies and weird, cryptic, eldritch creatures. But what really makes this series truly special is the way that Wolfe explores themes like memory, power, and the nature of storytelling itself. And the thing is, you have to dive into those themes to truly understand this book. You can't just read it at face value as a story. You have to look at all the symbolism to truly understand the Book of the New Sun. In my opinion, this is truly a masterpiece, and I wish more people would read it. The Abhorsion, where necromancy, talking cats, and ancient bells that control the dead are all just part of the job. Welcome to the Old Kingdom series by Garth Nix. The series, starting with Sabriel, follows a young girl named Sabriel, who has the small responsibility of literally keeping the dead from rising. As the daughter of the Abhorsion, basically a necromancer with a strict moral code, she takes up her father's magical bells and sword to protect the Old Kingdom. And along the way, she's joined by Mogget, a snarky talking cat who definitely is more than he seems and is one of my favorite characters in the books. And also, I love the audiobooks narrated by Tim Curry. He does an amazing voice with Mogget. Now, it's the unique blend of magic systems here, the charter magic versus free magic, and the eerie atmosphere and characters is what really makes the Old Kingdom stand out. This is one of my favorite young adult fantasy series. And Garth Nix does an amazing job at developing characters we can't help but root for. I always appreciate the unique spins on fantasy that Garth Nix writes because there's really not quite anything like his books. So if you love dark, atmospheric fantasy with a smart, capable protagonist and enough undead shenanigans to keep you up at night, you should definitely give the Old Kingdom series a read. The Faithful and the Fallen by John Gwynne. This one managed to make it into my top 10 this year. That's how much I enjoyed it. Now, it's not necessarily reinventing fantasy, but it is honed and as sharp as a double-edged blade. The author's love for Scandinavian folklore, mythology, and landscapes is clear in this series. I mean, it kind of feels like a Norse epic in a way. Now, as there's this god war being fought over the banished lands, we're introduced to some characters that are so human and truly some of my favorite characters I've read in a long time. I felt so attached to some of these characters and the friendships that they gain, which made the stakes and the tension during battle scenes that much higher. And thankfully, John Gwynne is simply the best at writing action. Not only were there some incredible, intense action scenes, but the heartfelt character moments are so strong in this series. The relationships between characters are complex and evolving, adding a lot of emotional depth to The Faithful and the Fallen. If you haven't checked out this series yet, I highly recommend it. I really need to read more by John Gwynne. Reflecting on Harry Potter as a series is like revisiting a magical chapter of my own life. I mean, these books had a profound impact, not just on the literary world, but on an entire generation of readers, myself included. I still remember the sense of wonder as I was introduced to Hogwarts, a place that quickly felt like it became a second home. And the magic of these books lies not just in the fantastical elements, but in the way they speak to universal themes. Friendship, found family, bravery, fighting for good, and the importance of owning one's mistakes sincerely, no matter how much it hurts. As the series progressed, the characters grew up, and so did I, and each book marked a different stage of both Harry's journey and my own, tackling more complex themes and darker challenges. I think that's one reason these books resonate so deeply. They're a coming-of-age story for an entire generation, and we were right there with Harry, Hermione, and Ron as they faced their fears, made difficult choices, and learned about the complexities of the world. I mean, the impact of the Harry Potter series extends far beyond its pages. It sparked a global phenomenon, bringing people together, inspiring a love for reading, and even creating new words and phrases that have become part of our cultural lexicon. The books have been a gateway to the fantasy genre for many, and I loved Harry Potter growing up. But then, for religious reasons, my family banned the books in the house while I was still trying to read through Order of the Phoenix. It felt like a real umbrage move to me, so I hid the books under my bed and I listened to the audiobooks when I could, because this was a series that meant a lot to me. Now, on a personal level, the series taught me about the power of resilience, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the idea that love is the most potent magic of all. And I'm not necessarily talking about romantic love, just pure love. Now, even now, years after reading the final book, the lessons and memories from the Harry Potter series still remain with me. And that's just a testament to the power of storytelling, that these books continue to inspire comfort and entertain readers of all ages around the world. When I think of the giants of the fantasy genre, I think of the names J.R.R. Tolkien, George R.R. Martin, and Robert Jordan. Robert Jordan's The Wheel of Time is a monumental achievement in epic fantasy, and after his passing, before he could finish the series, he left behind extensive notes and outlines for the ending, which his widow and editor Harriet McDougall entrusted to Brandon Sanderson. And Sanderson managed to pull off a really successful conclusion while maintaining the same tone and style of Jordan's world, while also bringing along some of his own strengths to the narrative. From a story that starts off in the quiet village of Emond's Field and feels very reminiscent of Tolkien's work, it quickly diverges and grows into this epic journey following Rand al'Thor and his friends as they're propelled into this huge quest, and it really becomes its own, rich with unique lore and characters. And as the novel progresses, readers are introduced to the Aes Sedai, a very mysterious and powerful group of women who wield wield the One Power, which is a central element to the series' intricate magic system. Basically, the One Power comes from the true source, and this is divided into two halves, Sayadar and Sayadin. Now, Sayadar can be accessed only by women, whereas Sayadar is reserved for male channelers of the One Power. And we quickly find out that the male half has been corrupted by the Dark One, causing all male magic users to go mad. Now, as the series progresses, there's a lot of details to this magic system that I found so fascinating, but magic system aside, the world that Robert Jordan has created has so many layers to it, so many unique cultures and layers of political intrigue, ancient prophecies, and this struggle between light and shadow. The Wheel of Time is a towering achievement, not just for its sheer length, but for the depth of its world building and the complexity of its plot, and just the journey of these characters is incredible, and that's why it is a must-read in the fantasy genre. Now, with the upcoming release of Wind and Truth, how can I not recommend the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson? Imagine a world ravaged by violent high storms, giant magical swords that can be summoned into your hand with 10 heartbeats, and a group of ancient warriors, the Knights Radiant, trying to return and save humanity from an impending doom. Oh, and did I mention that each book in the series is over 1,000 pages long? Yes, you're in for a marathon with the Stormlight Archive, but trust me, it's a good one. The series kicks off with The Way of Kings, following three main characters: Kaladin, a former soldier turned slave who has a knack for surviving impossible situations; Shallan, an artist scholar with a dangerous secret; and Dalinar, a warlord turned reluctant visionary who's receiving prophetic visions about the end of the world. Sanderson creates a sprawling, intricate narrative filled with deep themes like honor and betrayal and redemption, and of course, he doesn't skimp on the signature hard magic systems that he's so known for creating. Here, of course, the main feature is Stormlight, this magical energy that powers everything from healing to gravity manipulation, and it's also used for things like their currency and used as a lighting source. Now, these are all characters that are struggling with their mental health, and they're going through a lot of struggles, and they're growing through the course of the books. Kaladin's arc alone is going to tug at your heartstrings, and the mysterious lore of the Knights Radiant is going to make you want to flip back pages trying to piece everything together. Whether it's surge binding or shard blades, there's so many iconic elements in the world of Roshar, which is why this is one of my favorite series of all time. Imagine a protagonist who is the antithesis of the traditional sword-wielding hero, Elric, the sickly albino emperor of the decaying island nation of Melniboné, frail yet potent in sorcery, dependent on drugs and his vampiric sword Stormbringer for vitality. His tale is one of contrasts, strength and vulnerability, power and desperation. Elric's moral ambiguity, his flaws, and his internal conflicts really stood out at the time. Elric is not the valiant hero. He's an anti-hero that is burdened with the weight of destiny and the price of his actions. This is a complex and tragic figure whose struggles with morality and power are at the core of the narrative. Now, Elric is a character that has had a huge lasting impact on the genre, paving the way for more nuanced and morally complex characters like Geralt of Rivia from the Witcher books. He even heavily inspired George R.R. Martin's Targaryen family, and of course, his sword Stormbringer was the inspiration for Frostmourne in World of Warcraft, and Brandon Sanderson's Nightblood from Warbreaker. Now, Melniboné itself is kind of a character in the saga, a once powerful empire now in decline. It's a land steeped in ancient traditions and dark magic. The world building here paints a picture of a civilization that's both splendid and corrupt, where beauty and brutality exist side by side. And this dichotomy is reflected in Elric's own nature and his struggle to reconcile his duty with his personal ethics. Elric's iconic and sentient soul-stealing sword is both a boon and a curse. He has a complex relationship with his weapon, his dependence on it for power, and the price that he has to pay for this is a really compelling exploration of the addiction and cost of power. Now, there's also a cosmic scope here. Moorcock was one of the first to create a multiverse, spanning the stories of Corum, Erekos, Hawkmoon, and many others, all dealing with interconnected realms and hidden Easter eggs, and of course the reincarnated Eternal Champion appearing on each world and age. And Elric is all part of this cosmic struggle between order and chaos. These are short, action-filled, and fast-paced, all while managing to be very thoughtful and introspective, with a lot of philosophical depth and exploration of existential themes. Tigana is an extremely well-written book. I think this is one of the best entry points to Guy Gavriel Kay. His books are just incredibly well-written. I do love the characters in this one, though a few of them do kind of fall flat a bit. In Tigana, basically a dark sorcerer not only curses the land to destroy Tigana, but also erase any record of it, to destroy its history and the memory of its people. However, a group rises up to fight back and restore the memory of Tigana and restore the country. In a few places, it kind of slows down and drags a little bit, but then the ending makes up for all of it. It ties everything together so nicely. I love how Guy Gavriel Kay develops these different cultures in his books and how this one is kind of inspired by Renaissance Italy. It's one of the things I find the most fascinating about his novels, and I really want to read more. If you have not read anything by Guy Gavriel Kay, I urge you to give his books a chance, because he is a phenomenal writer, and I think there's a lot of you in my audience that are going to really enjoy his books, because I am enjoying them so far, and I can't wait to read more. Now, the First Law trilogy is this gritty, character-driven series, where Abercrombie explores the complexities of human nature. The story follows several main characters, each with their own agenda and motivations. There's Logan Ninefingers, the Bloody Nine. He's a barbarian with a fearsome reputation, a terrifying alter ego, and a violent past that he's trying to escape. Such an amazing character. Next is Sandan Glokta, formerly a renowned swordsman. He's been transformed into a bitter cripple who's now working as a professional torturer, cutting treason out of the Union one confession at a time. Despite his bitterness, he's a character that brings a lot of humor to the series. His inner monologue is filled with deliciously cynical thoughts and clever remarks. And of all the characters, Glokta is the one I ended up trusting the most. And by the end of the trilogy, he ended up being one of my favorite characters in fantasy. Then we have Giselle Dan Luther, a nobleman, a talented fencer. He's a pompous, pretentious, entitled elitist who goes through an intense character arc. These are all characters you wouldn't think you'd end up liking and rooting for, but you do. Now, their stories all intertwine as they get caught up in a power struggle that threatens to plunge the world into chaos, and this is a world of war, political intrigue, and conspiracy. The characters are all fleshed out extremely well, meaning their motivations and behavior emerge naturally due to their personal history and everything that we know about them. This means the characters are very believable, and believability is an important tool to make readers feel immersed. You have to be realistic about these things. Now, if you prefer audiobooks, Stephen Pacey's narration, he sets the bar high. Honestly, he elevates the characters, and he makes this one of my best experiences with audiobooks ever. Malazan, Book of the Fallen. You can say Malazan, you can say Malazan, I don't think it really matters, guys. Anyways, this is a series that is about as challenging as it is rewarding. Malazan is known for its complex narrative structure. It also has a vast cast of characters. I mean, sometimes you'll read a book and it will completely switch the party that you're following. Then later in the series, you'll go back to the other characters. There's just a lot going on in Malazan. Now, I also really like how Steven Erikson adds a lot of philosophical themes into the story. It's a series that really demands your attention, but the payoff is so worth it. And it is truly epic. It spans continents and ages and delves into the histories and war and magic of the Malazan Empire. Malazan Empire? Okay, I'm not being consistent anymore. It doesn't matter. From what I've read so far, honestly, Erikson's world building is kind of unparalleled in the fantasy genre, and I feel like a lot of people are sleeping on Malazan Book of the Fallen. I feel like people get too intimidated by these books, but it is one of the most incredible fantasy series that I've read so far. I highly recommend reading The Legend of Drizzt, and I would recommend starting with the Dark Elf trilogy. This is the prequel series that follows the origin story of Drizzt Do'Urden, who's one of the most famous fantasy characters ever written. Drizzt is the iconic drow elf attempting to escape and push past the evil nature of his kin. And the Dark Elf trilogy follows his origins in the subterranean Underdark in the city known as Menzoberranzan, where the evil matrons of the drow society all worship this spider goddess named Lolth. And it follows Drizzt attempting to escape the evil of his kin and escape from the Underdark and basically find his place in a world that would ordinarily condemn him. I would say it's a must-read for anyone interested in D&D and just any fantasy fan. I mean, there is some really great world building going on in The Legend of Drizzt, and I also just love the friendships that he makes along the way and the themes in the story. Also, R.A. Salvatore writes some really badass fight scenes, and also he manages to touch on a lot of like emotional sides of Drizzt as well. Now, if you're ready for a fairy tale Rumpelstiltskin sort of retelling that's as cold as winter and sharp as silver, then Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik is a must-read. The story follows Miriam, a moneylender's daughter who decides that if her dad isn't going to be good at the family business, that she'll step in and start collecting those debts herself. Turns out she's really good at turning silver into gold, which is how she catches the attention of the Stark, a frosty fey king who loves shiny things. There's also Wanda, a peasant girl working off her father's debt, and Irina, a noblewoman navigating royal intrigue and demons, and you've got yourself an intricately woven narrative where every thread matters. Now, Novik's world building is as atmospheric as ever in this book. I actually enjoyed Spinning Silver a lot more than Uprooted, and it really is the perfect book to read during the winter. This Russian-inspired setting, the magical creatures, and it also has a lot of plot twists that keep you hooked. So if you're into dark fairy tale retellings, deep character-driven stories, and a freezing cold winter setting, then Spinning Silver should be your next read. Okay, I think that's enough to keep you busy for quite a while. Let me know if you enjoyed the video, and a huge thank you to all my patrons and my channel members that make these videos possible.